Dry Creek, Wyoming, did not welcome newcomers. It endured them. The town was a stubborn fingernail of civilization clawed into the red dirt, wedged between stony hills that bled rust-colored dust onto every porch and windowsill. It was 1887, and the wind that scoured the single main street tasted of grit, cold nights, and the twin disappointments of a half-finished railroad and a silver mine that had given up its last ghost a decade prior. Suspicion was the local currency, traded in sidelong glances and tight-lipped greetings. The word of the Lord, preached loudly on Sundays, was the law of the town, but the law of the gun, holstered and ready, was the law of the land. The noon stagecoach arrived in its usual cloud of dust and complaint, the horses blowing hard, their hides lathered with sweat and alkali. From its dark interior emerged a single passenger, a woman who set her worn leather boots on the ground with a quiet finality. Eleanor Dawson was 25, though the hardships of her past had etched a more somber age into the fine lines around her eyes. She was a nurse who lived out of a medical satchel in a single carpet bag, a life forced upon her by a string of tragedies. First, the smallpox that had claimed her parents, then the mining accident that had stolen her fiancé. In each town she had tried to settle, misfortune had seemed to follow, and people, in their fear, had found it easier to blame the messenger than the message of mortality she carried. They called her cursed. Her own secret goal was far simpler: to find a place where her hands, skilled and gentle, could heal without being seen as an omen. Watching from the shade of his office porch was Sheriff Jude Hollis. At 33, he had the stillness of a man who had seen too much movement in his youth. A former Union cavalryman, he now fought smaller, more tangled battles, keeping the peace between anxious townsfolk, rowdy railroad crews, and the ever-present threat of the Rimrock gang. He was a man of practical morality, his gaze steady and calm. His own peace was a fragile thing, tethered to the well-being of his 16-year-old brother, Ben, whose leg had been twisted since birth, a constant, aching reminder of the world's casual cruelty. Jude's singular ambition was to hold Dry Creek together with the sheer force of his will. The town's will, however, was already turning against the newcomer. Mrs. Eudora Finch, the formidable matriarch of the Church Ladies' Guild, watched Eleanor from the window of the mercantile. She saw not a woman seeking refuge, but a harbinger. Whispers she had started weeks ago, based on letters from a cousin in a town Eleanor had recently left, were already bearing fruit. It was Lyle Hart, the owner of the apothecary, who gave those whispers a voice, fearing this traveling nurse would cut into his business of selling tonics and remedies of questionable merit. He fanned the flames of superstition, his words slithering from customer to customer. Eleanor had not even had time to brush the trail dust from her skirt when a scream sliced through the afternoon torpor. A woman shrieked, a sound of pure panic, and a small crowd converged near the water trough. A little boy, no older than 5, was on the ground, his face swelling, his breaths coming in ragged, high-pitched whistles. His hand was a puffy, reddened knot. "It was a bee," his mother cried. "Helpless. He cannot breathe." Before anyone could move, before the general paralysis of horror could break, Eleanor was there. She dropped her bags, her movements swift and sure. "Let me see him," she said, her voice low and commanding. She knelt, her eyes taking in the boy's purpling lips, the frantic heaving of his small chest. On his swollen finger, a silver ring was cutting deeply into the flesh, acting like a tourniquet. "Hold him still," she ordered the mother. From a small pouch on her belt, she produced a scalpel, its steel catching the harsh sunlight. A gasp went through the crowd. Lyle Hart stepped forward, his face a mask of outrage. "What do you think you are doing?" Eleanor ignored him, with a surgeon's precision. She slipped the blade beneath the ring and, with a sharp twist, snapped the metal band. Then, from her medical satchel, she pulled a small, stoppered vial and a syringe. The crowd murmured, their fear coiling into something darker. Misses. Finch made a sign against evil. "That is poison," someone hissed. "It is medicine," Eleanor replied without looking up. She drew a minuscule amount of morphine into the syringe, a dose so small it was barely visible. "It will slow the body's panic." She found a vein in the boy's arm, her touch impossibly gentle, and administered the medicine. She took a handkerchief from her sleeve, a simple white cloth embroidered with the delicate purple flowers of thyme, and dipped it in the cool water of the trough, pressing it against the boy's face and hand. The effect was almost instantaneous. The violent swelling began to recede. The boy's frantic gasps eased, his breathing deepening into a more regular rhythm. His eyes fluttered open. He was alive. The town square was utterly silent. The only sounds the creak of a distant windmill and the soft coo of a pigeon on the church steeple. The moment felt like a miracle, but in a town primed for suspicion. A miracle performed by a strange woman with a knife and a needle looked dangerously like witchcraft. Sheriff Jude Hollis pushed through the crowd, his presence parting the townsfolk like a stone in a stream. His gaze fell on Eleanor, still kneeling beside the child, her face calm, her hands steady. He looked at the relieved mother, the breathing boy, and then at the wary, accusing faces surrounding them. His badge, the simple star of the law, seemed to represent a fragile authority in the face of such raw, primal fear. He saw Eleanor tuck the thyme-scented handkerchief back into her sleeve, a small, quiet gesture of order restored. He understood then that she was not a source of chaos, but perhaps a response to it. That evening, the whispers followed Eleanor as she took a small room above the blacksmith's shop. They clung to her like the ever-present dust. As she unpacked her few belongings, she could hear the children playing in the street below. One of them, mimicking the hushed tones of his parents, chanted a new rhyme. Hex nurse, brings the hearse." Eleanor stood very still, her back to the window, and squeezed her eyes shut. She would not cry. She took a deep breath, the air thin and cold, and began meticulously organizing her medical supplies. She would stay a week, no more. "I owe this place the debt of my breath," she whispered to the empty room. She would pay it and be gone. Night fell hard on Dry Creek, the sky a vast, star-dusted blanket of black. The only real light and noise came from the Longhorn Saloon, a river of yellow lamplight and rough laughter spilling onto the street. Suddenly, that light was joined by a more sinister, flickering orange. A cry went up, raw and urgent. Fire. The back storeroom of the Longhorn was engulfed in flames. Men poured out of the saloon, shouting and disorganized. A bucket brigade formed, but it was slow and futile against the hungry roar of the fire. The scent of burning wood and whiskey filled the air. Jude was already there, directing the men, his voice a sharp, clear command above the chaos. Then, a railroad foreman shouted, "Matthew is still in there." He went to the storeroom for a barrel of nails. Before Jude could stop her, Eleanor darted past him, her face set with a fierce determination. She pulled the bottom of her skirt over her mouth and nose and disappeared into the billowing black smoke. The crowd gasped. A woman's voice, sharp with accusation, cut through the noise. "She brings it with her. She came, and now there is fire." Jude swore under his breath and plunged into the smoke after her. The heat was a physical blow, the air thick and choking. He found her dragging an unconscious man twice her size toward the doorway. The man's hair was singed, his face blackened with soot. Eleanor was coughing, her eyes streaming, but she did not let go. "I have him," Jude yelled, his voice rough. He scooped the railroad worker into his arms and carried him out. Then he turned back and found Eleanor, swaying on her feet, her lungs gasping for clean air. He lifted her easily and carried her out into the cool, star-filled night. He set her down a safe distance from the flames. For a long moment, they stood together, breathing hard, their faces smudged with soot. They were a tableau of shared crisis. The lawman and the healer, facing the fire, and behind them, the accusing eyes of the town. The whispers had started again, louder this time, a venomous chorus. Jude's attention, however, was on the ground. Away from the main chaos, near the corner of the burning building, he saw a set of boot prints in the soft dirt. They were deep and clear. The heel was worn in a peculiar way, and the sole had a distinct pattern he did not recognize. It was not the mark of a railroad worker's boot, nor the worn leather of a townsman. More importantly, it was not the signature print of the Rimrock gang, whose tracks he knew as well as his own name. Someone in Dry Creek, he realized with a cold certainty, had set this fire. They had set it and wanted it blamed on someone else, on the gang, perhaps, or, he thought, looking at Eleanor's exhausted but defiant face, on the strange new woman who had arrived just that morning, the cursed nurse. She was the perfect scapegoat. The morning after the fire, Eleanor did not pack her bags. A stubbornness as hard as the Wyoming rock had settled in her bones. Instead of surrendering to the whispers, she walked to the livery stable, its scent of hay and horse a comforting reality against the town's nervous fictions. She found a spot near the wide double doors, where the morning sun offered a little warmth, and set up her clinic. It was nothing more than a small, scrubbed pine table and a single straight-backed chair. But to her, it was a declaration. She placed her medical satchel on the table, opened it, and waited. Her first patient was the blacksmith, a man with a forearm blistered from a flying spark. He came grudgingly, his eyes shifting as if expecting judgment. Eleanor said nothing about the fire or the stairs. She simply cleaned the burn, applied a soothing salve, and wrapped it in clean linen. When he asked what he owed, she looked at his leather apron and the honest sweat on his brow. A wedge of cornbread, if your wife has extra, she said. More people came, trickling in like a hesitant stream, a mother with a feverish child, a young railroad worker who had sliced his hand on a steel rail, an old man whose joints ached with a deep, persistent pain. Eleanor treated them all with the same quiet competence. She lanced boils, stitched gashes, and prescribed willow bark tea for fevers. In return, she received 2 eggs, a jar of pickled beets, and a promise that a loose shutter on her window would be fixed. It was the unwritten currency of the West, a trade of skill for sustenance, a fragile economy of mutual need that existed just beneath the town's veneer of suspicion. Sheriff Jude Hollis watched her for a time from his office across the street. He saw not a curse, but a quiet, formidable strength. He saw a woman claiming her ground not with a gun or a loud voice, but with a needle and thread and a steady hand. He crossed the street, his boots stirring the dust. The townsfolk who were watching quickly looked away. Eleanor saw him approach and felt a familiar tension tighten in her shoulders. But she did not stop wrapping a poultice on a ranch hand's sprained wrist. Jude stopped before her table. He did not offer sympathy or ask about the fire. He held out a piece of paper. "This is a temporary permit," he said, his voice even. "It says you are licensed to practice medicine in the township of Dry Creek, pending review by the circuit judge when he passes through next month." She finished her knot and looked up at him, surprised. "Why? The law says a town this size needs a doctor or someone with medical training. Right now, you are it." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the handful of people waiting. "I have told them you are under the protection of this office. That means no one is to interfere with your work. The law is the law." He did not smile, but the look in his eyes was one of deep, unwavering respect. He was not saving her. He was acknowledging her right to save herself. Her work did not go unchallenged. Lyle Hart's apothecary business began to suffer. One afternoon, a young woman came to Eleanor, her baby fussing weakly in her arms. The woman was holding a small, dark bottle from Hart's shop. He said his miracle-soothing syrup would stop the teething pain, but the baby just sleeps all day and will not eat. Eleanor took one look at the infant's listless eyes and tiny, constricted pupils. She uncorked the bottle and sniffed, The sickly sweet smell of opium was unmistakable. "Stop giving him this," she said, her voice sharp but low. "It is not soothing him, it is poisoning him. Bathe his gums in cool water. Let him chew on a piece of clean, wet linen." The mother's eyes widened in horror. She threw the bottle to the ground, where it shattered in the dust. The exchange did not go unnoticed. Lyle Hart, who had been watching from his doorway, stormed across the street, his face blotchy with rage. "You have no right," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You come into my town and try to ruin my name. I provide a service to these people. You are taking the bread from my mouth." "You are selling poison to mothers," Eleanor said, her voice cold as a river stone. "If that is your bread, then let it turn to ash." Jude heard the raised voices and stepped out of his office. He did not intervene, but he stood there, watching, his presence a silent warning to Hart not to escalate. The apothecary owner sputtered, cast a hateful glare at Eleanor, and retreated to his shop. Jude made a mental note. He had no proof of what was in those bottles, but he had his suspicions, another piece of a puzzle he could not yet solve. The social pressure mounted. Mrs. Eudora Finch. Seeing her whispers were not enough to drive Eleanor away. Organized a special prayer service at the church. The stated purpose was to pray for the town's safety and deliverance from recent troubles. The unspoken purpose was to cast out the evil that had so clearly arrived with the new nurse. That evening, as the pious voices drifted out from the church's open windows, Eleanor walked by on the opposite side of the street. She saw Eudora's young daughter sitting on the porch steps of their house, racked by a deep, dry cough. The girl looked miserable in the fading light. Eleanor continued onto her room, but a short while later, she returned. She moved silently, a shadow in the twilight, and placed a small, corked bottle on the Finch's porch railing. It was a simple cough syrup she had made from honey and thyme. She then disappeared back into the night. When Eudora came out of the church, flush with righteous certainty, she found the bottle. She knew instantly who had left it. She stood on her porch, the bottle in her hand, her face a storm of confusion and wounded pride. She took the medicine inside but told no one. The world itself seemed determined to test the town's frayed nerves. The sky, which had been a placid blue for weeks, turned a bruised yellow. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that quickly rose to a vicious shriek. A sandstorm, the first of the season, descended on Dry Creek like a biblical plague. Dust and sand swirled in a blinding, stinging torrent, reducing visibility to mere feet. The world became a maelstrom of grit and noise. The old livery stable, its timbers already weakened by age, groaned under the assault. With a deafening crack, a section of its roof tore away, and a wall sagged inward, trapping a half-dozen terrified horses in their stalls. Jude was already fighting his way toward the stable. A kerchief tied over his face, he saw Eleanor, a slight figure battling the gale, running from the other direction. There was no hesitation in her, only purpose. Together, they forced the splintered door open against the wind. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the panicked screams of the animals. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm. Jude used his strength to heave fallen timbers aside, while Eleanor, her voice calm and soothing, coaxed the frightened horses, her small hands working quickly on tangled ropes and jammed latches. Sand gritted between their teeth, and the wind howled like a banshee. Finally, they led the last of the animals out into the relative safety of the open, wind-swept street just as the rest of the stable roof collapsed with a final, shuddering roar. When the wind finally died down hours later, leaving behind a world coated in a fine red powder, Jude insisted Eleanor come to his small house, which also served as the sheriff's office, to wash the grit from her eyes and hair. It was there she met Ben. Jude's younger brother was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by an intricate collection of gears, wires, and wood scraps. He was working on a miniature, functional model of a railroad track switcher. His face, bright with intelligence, lit up when he saw her medical bag. His damaged leg was propped on a stool, and he shifted it, wincing. The damp from the storm makes it ache, he explained, his voice open and friendly, devoid of the suspicion she had grown used to. He peppered her with questions about her tools, his fascination with the mechanics of her trade genuine. Seeing his discomfort, Eleanor acted on instinct. She took out her simple, thyme-scented handkerchief. "Sometimes pressure helps," she said, her voice gentle. She showed him how to fold it into a thick pad and wrap it firmly around the aching joint of his leg. The scent of the thyme is for comfort. Jude stood in the doorway, watching the easy interaction. He saw the kindness in her hands, the unguarded trust in his brother's face. A warmth spread through his chest, followed by a familiar, cold spike of fear. He had built his life around duty and the protection of his brother, walls to keep the painful memories of the war and the losses he had endured at bay. This woman, with her quiet courage and gentle hands, was a threat to those walls. He was afraid to care for anyone else, afraid of the searing pain of losing them. A few days later, a fragile peace seemed to have settled. Jude found Eleanor sitting outside her makeshift clinic at the end of a long day. He offered her a cup of coffee from the pot perpetually simmering on his office stove. She accepted, and after one sip, her lips quirked into a small, wry smile. "Sheriff," she said, her eyes twinkling with a hint of humor, "you drink coffee like you expect it to be bitter medicine." A short, surprised laugh escaped him. It was a sound he rarely made. It gets the job done. The easy moment lingered. His eyes fell on the Winchester rifle she kept propped just inside her doorway, a precaution he had insisted upon. "Do you know how to use that?" he asked. "I know which end the bullet comes out of," she replied dryly. "That is a start." He stood up. "Come on." He led her to the edge of town, where the vast, empty prairie began. He set up an old tin can on a fence post. He passed her the rifle, its wood smooth and its steel heavy in her hands. He stood behind her, his voice a low rumble near her ear as he explained how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. His hands covered hers for a moment to adjust her grip, his touch firm and impersonal. Yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her. It was a lesson in survival, an act of practical care. But for both of them, it felt like something more. It felt like the beginning of trust. They were walking back toward town, the scent of gunpowder still faint in the air, when a low, rumbling sound began, growing steadily louder. It was the groan of heavy wheels on steel, moving too fast. A freight car, laden with massive timbers for the new railroad tunnel, had broken free from its siding. It careened down the gentle slope of the track, gathering speed. A runaway behemoth aimed at the heart of the town. It smashed into the reinforced barrier at the end of the line with a sickening crunch of splintering wood and screaming metal. The town was safe, but the message was clear. Jude ran to the siding where the car had been secured. He knelt in the dirt. The heavy wooden chocks were still there, but the thick iron pin that locked the brake lever in place was gone. Vanished. This was no accident. He stood up, his face grim, and looked back at the town huddled under the vast Wyoming sky. The fire, the whispers, the sabotage. The enemy was not some faceless gang hiding in the hills. The enemy was here. The runaway freight car became a new verse in the town's litany of misfortune, and Eleanor Dawson's name was the refrain. The incident, a clear case of sabotage to Jude's eyes, was twisted by gossip into another symptom of the curse she had brought to Dry Creek. The fact that no one was hurt was ignored. What mattered was the chaos, the proximity to disaster. It had happened on her watch. Her small clinic by the livery felt the chill first. Patients who had come to her in desperation now chose to suffer in silence or pay Lyle Hart's prices for his sugary tonics. Mothers pulled their children to the other side of the street when she passed. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were a wall of sound she could feel against her skin. The question began to haunt her in the quiet hours of the night. a corrosive doubt that ate at the edges of her resolve. Were they right? Was she a magnet for tragedy? A walking storm cloud? The thought of leaving, of releasing the town from her blighted presence, became a constant, painful temptation. To run would be to admit they were right. To stay felt like an act of selfish cruelty. Jude, meanwhile, was consumed by the cold logic of the crime. The fire, the runaway car, they were not random acts of hooliganism. They were calculated blows against the railroad, the town's fragile hope for a future. An anonymous letter to the railroad company detailing Dry Creek's unstable and dangerous environment confirmed his suspicion. This was an organized effort to make the land worthless so someone could buy it for pennies on the dollar. His investigation was a quiet, methodical process. While the town saw curses, Jude looked for clues. At the site where the freight car's brake pin had been pulled, he found something the saboteur had missed: a handful of square-headed nails dropped in the dust. They were a specialized type, used for assembling heavy shipping crates, stronger than the common round-headed nails used for building. He pocketed them, his expression grim. There was only one place in Dry Creek that sold hardware of that specific make: Lyle Hart's Apothecary and Mercantile. While Jude pursued his leads, a different kind of crisis demanded Eleanor's attention. A young man, his face pale with panic, came running from the railroad camp just outside of town. He was one of the Chinese laborers, a group the townsfolk treated with a mixture of contempt and invisibility. He spoke in frantic, broken English, gesturing wildly toward the camp. Man hurt, hand, bad hurt. Eleanor grabbed her medical satchel without a second thought. She followed him to the makeshift settlement, a collection of canvas tents and lean-tos that stood in stark contrast to the wooden permanence of Dry Creek. A small crowd of white foremen and workers stood by, their expressions ranging from indifferent to annoyed. On the ground, a Chinese man was cradling his hand, his face a mask of agony. A heavy gear had slipped and crushed his fingers. "Get him out of the way," the foreman grumbled. "We are behind schedule." Eleanor pushed past him, her small frame radiating an authority that made the larger man take an involuntary step back. She knelt beside the injured man, her voice soft and reassuring, even though she knew he likely did not understand her words. The hand was a mangled mess of blood and bone. Ignoring the muttering of the onlookers, she went to work. She cleaned the wounds with carbolic acid, the sharp, clean scent cutting through the dust. With delicate precision, she began to set the broken bones, her fingers moving with a practiced, intimate knowledge of human anatomy. Jude arrived as she was wrapping the hand in clean splints and linen. He had seen the commotion from his office. He took in the scene at a glance: the injured laborer, Eleanor's absolute focus, the hostile semicircle of white workers. He walked directly to the foreman. "This man will be unable to work for some time," Jude said, his voice flat and non-negotiable. "The railroad company will pay his wages until he is healed. And Dr. Dawson's fee." He deliberately used the honorific, a challenge to anyone who saw her as anything less. The foreman opened his mouth to protest, but something in the sheriff's cold, steady gaze made him swallow his words. The crowd dispersed, their prejudice momentarily silenced by the twin powers of the law and undeniable competence. Eleanor finished her work, gave the injured man's friend instructions on how to administer laudanum for the pain, and stood up, her back aching. That evening, Jude saw the single lantern burning in her room. He knew the toll a day like this could take, the slow draining of spirit that came from fighting both injury and ignorance. He went to his kitchen, where Ben was meticulously sorting a collection of postage stamps in a large album, each tiny square of paper a window to a world far from Dry Creek. Jude ladled some of the thick beef stew Ben had made into a bowl. He found Eleanor sitting at her small table, too weary to even light her stove. She looked up, startled. As he entered, he set the bowl of stew before her. It was a simple, unspoken gesture of care, a recognition of her exhaustion. It was not a rescue. It was reinforcement. "Ben's stew," he said, He is a better cook than I am." She ate in silence for a few moments, the warmth of the food a small comfort against the day's chill. Her eyes fell on the lantern sitting on her table, its flame burning bright and steady inside its protective glass chimney. "My father gave me this," she said quietly. "He said the truth is like a flame. It is small and easily blown out, unless you protect it." Jude looked at the light, then at her. "It is a good lantern." The next afternoon, while taking her own small bag of trash to the communal burn barrel behind the Main Street buildings, Eleanor noticed something in the bin belonging to Lyle Hart's shop. A corner of a freight invoice was sticking out from beneath a pile of spoiled vegetables. Something about it made her pause, acting on an impulse she did not fully understand. She reached in and pulled it out. Her eyes scanned the items listed. In addition to his usual order of patent medicines and dry goods, there was a crate containing a large quantity of ether and another of tar oil. Both were highly flammable. Neither had any place in a respectable apothecary's inventory. Her blood ran cold. These were the tools of an arsonist. She folded the receipt, her hands trembling slightly, and tucked it into her pocket. This was not a whisper or a rumor. This was proof. She walked directly to the sheriff's office and placed it on his desk without a word. Jude studied the paper, his expression hardening into granite. The pieces were clicking into place, the strange boot print, the special nails. And now this. A well-dressed stranger had arrived in town 2 days before, a lawyer from back east named Ashcroft. Jude had seen him in quiet, intense conversation with Lyle Hart more than once. Hart must have sensed the net tightening. Perhaps he saw Eleanor leaving the sheriff's office. Or perhaps his own paranoia got the better of him. He decided he needed to strike first, to turn the town's fear into a weapon he could aim. He found Mrs. Finch, her heart already primed with suspicion and grief over a son she had lost years ago in a mining accident, and fed her a story. He claimed he had seen Eleanor performing strange rituals, muttering incantations over strange-smelling potions. It was all the spark Eudora needed. Within the hour, a crowd had formed. It started as a small group of church ladies, their face tight with conviction, but it grew as Hart's employees and other anxious townsfolk joined in. They moved as one body, a beast of righteous anger, toward Eleanor's small clinic at the livery. "Which someone yelled. "She brings us nothing but ruin," cried another. Eleanor heard them coming. She stood up and barred the flimsy door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was trapped. The shouting grew louder, more menacing. A rock slammed against the wall next to the window. Just as the first man put his shoulder to the door, Jude Hollis appeared. He did not run. He simply walked into the space between the mob and the door, his presence sucking the air out of their fury. He was not wearing his gun belt. He did not need it. His authority was a palpable force. He stood there, his feet planted, his face calm and unreadable. Lyle Hart pushed his way to the front. "Sheriff, this is town business. She is a curse on us all." Jude's gaze did not waver. He looked past Hart, his eyes meeting those of each person in the crowd, one by one. He let the silence stretch, heavy and uncomfortable. "You have two choices," he said finally, his voice not loud, but carrying with absolute clarity over the shuffling feet and nervous coughs. "You can step past me, or you can go home." No one moved. They looked at the sheriff, the man who represented the law, standing as a human shield for the woman they had condemned. They saw not a lawman protecting a witch, but a man protecting a person. One by one, they began to back away, their anger dissolving into shame and uncertainty. Within minutes, the street was empty, save for Jude and the splintered wood of the doorframe. The quiet that followed was profound, broken only by the distant, lonely sound of a train whistle. But this was not the usual mournful call of the evening train. It was a series of short, frantic blasts, a signal of alarm. Jude and Eleanor looked at each other, And then both their heads snapped toward the rail spur that led to the tunnel construction site. A new light was blooming against the twilight sky. It was orange and flickered with a terrifying speed. It was coming from the isolated siding where the railroad company stored its most precious and dangerous cargo. The powder car was on fire. There was no time for thought, only the primal instinct to run toward the danger. Jude and Eleanor moved as one, their long shadows dancing grotesquely in the light of the fire. The wind, which had been a torment during the sandstorm, was now a malevolent accomplice, whipping the flames into a frenzy and carrying the acrid smell of burning pine and something sharp, something chemical, toward the town. The powder car sat on its isolated spur, a squat, dark box of annihilation. A long, sputtering fuse snaking from its undercarriage like a glowing serpent. If it blew, it would not only obliterate the entrance to the new tunnel, but also take with it the entire railroad camp and the first row of houses on the west end of Dry Creek. They reached the car, breathless, the heat a solid wall against their faces. Workers were shouting, some running toward the fire with useless buckets, others running away in terror. The fuse hissed, spitting sparks, relentlessly eating its way toward the car's iron belly. "Water," Eleanor yelled, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the wind and fire. She saw a line of rain barrels near a half-finished supply shed, while Jude sized up the heavy, locked door of the powder car. She grabbed 2 buckets, her movements economical and swift. She plunged them into the nearest barrel, the cold, slimy water a shocking contrast to the fire's heat, and hauled them, sloshing, back to the hissing fuse. She did not try to douse it completely. She knew a wet fuse could sometimes smolder and reignite. Instead, she poured a careful, steady stream of water a few inches ahead of the burning tip, soaking the cord, slowing its progress, buying them precious seconds. The hissing sound changed, becoming a sputtering, angry sizzle. Jude, meanwhile, had found a discarded length of steel rail. Ignoring the flames licking at the car's wooden frame, he wedged the rail into the seam of the heavy door's locking mechanism. He planted his feet, his entire body a coiled spring of desperate strength. The muscles in his back and shoulders corded as he threw all his weight against the makeshift lever. Metal screamed in protest. Wood splintered, and with a final, groaning crack, the lock gave way. He tore the door open. Inside, crates of dynamite were stacked next to barrels of black powder. The fuse was wired to a central barrel. "The fuse is inside," he yelled. He plunged his hands into the suffocating heat and smoke, grabbing the burning cord and yanking it free from the barrel, stamping it out under his boot heel until it was nothing but a blackened, inert piece of rope. For a moment, they stood in the fire's glow, panting, their lungs raw. They had done it. But the fire set to ignite the fuse had already spread to the car itself and a nearby stack of timber. The immediate threat of a massive explosion was gone, but the danger was far from over. A section of burning lumber collapsed, sending a shower of embers onto the nearby tents of the work camp. Men screamed as their canvas shelters caught fire. One man, his clothes smoldering, staggered out of a tent, his arm covered in blood from a piece of flying, red-hot shrapnel. The crisis changed shape, shifting from a battle of brute force against time to a chaotic medical emergency. The scene became a hellish landscape of smoke, pain, and fear, and in the center of it, Eleanor became an island of absolute calm. "Bring the injured here," she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. "You, get more water, and bring every clean sheet and rag you can find." Her makeshift clinic became the space between 2 supply wagons, illuminated by the flickering light of the fires. The first man she treated was the one with the shrapnel wound. It was a deep, jagged gash in his forearm, and blood was pulsing from a severed artery. She pressed her fingers firmly into the pressure point above the wound, her other hand reaching into her medical satchel. She worked with a focused intensity that seemed to block out the surrounding chaos. She stitched the artery with a fine, curved needle, her movements deft and sure. Then she cleaned the wound of debris and closed the flesh, her stitches small and neat even in the wavering, unreliable light. Another man was brought to her, his face and hands burned. She gently debrided the worst of the blisters, applied a thick, greasy salve to prevent infection, and wrapped his hands in clean linen. All the while, she spoke in a low, soothing monotone, calming the men not just with her medicine, but with her unshakable composure. Jude watched her, his own adrenaline slowly subsiding, replaced by a profound sense of awe and a sharp, protective ache in his chest. He saw her surrounded by blood and smoke, her face smudged with soot, a few strands of her hair blackened with ash where an ember had singed them. She had walked through fire, and instead of being consumed by it, she had commanded it, bent it to her will, and was now mending the damage it had wrought. He felt his heart contract. This was the woman they called a curse, this fearless, compassionate, incredibly capable woman. The instinct to protect her warred with the knowledge that she was the strongest person he had ever met. He looked down at his sheriff's badge, glinting in the firelight. It was spattered with mud from the bucket brigade. Justice, he thought, was not a clean business. You had to wade into the mud and the blood with the people you served. Some of the people were beginning to see it, too. A few of the railroad workers, men who had previously averted their eyes when she passed, now met her gaze with a simple, direct look of gratitude. One of them silently handed her a dipper of clean water. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a monumental shift. The shift, however, was not universal. On the edge of the chaos, drawn by the commotion, stood Eudora Finch and a few of her ladies. She watched Eleanor moving among the wounded, her expression not of relief, but of hardened suspicion. "Do not be fooled," she murmured to the woman beside her, her voice tight with conviction. "A bad trajectory always carries false miracles to make you lower your guard." For her, this was not a rescue. It was a more elaborate and dangerous form of deception. The curse was simply changing its disguise. The next afternoon, the tension in Dry Creek had eased, replaced by a weary quiet. Ben was at the kitchen table in the sheriff's office, carefully applying a hinge of glued paper to a new stamp in his album. Jude was cleaning his pistol, the familiar, repetitive motions a way to order his thoughts. Eleanor sat nearby, sterilizing her instruments in a pot of boiling water. The metallic clink of steel against steel, a soft counterpoint to the room's silence. Ben looked from his brother's grim face to Eleanor's tired one. He cleared his throat. "You know," he said, his young voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "Brother Jude's coffee is so bad, it could peel paint. But Miss Eleanor, she still drinks it." He paused for dramatic effect. This must be love. Eleanor choked back a laugh, a real, unguarded sound of amusement. Jude looked up from his pistol, a rare, faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. The simple, honest observation from the boy had pierced the gloom, letting a little light into the room. Later, when the town was quiet, Jude went back to the rail spur. The burned-out shell of the powder car was a stark, black skeleton against the evening sky. He was not looking for clues about the fire. He already knew who had the motive and the means. He was looking for proof. He circled the car, his eyes scanning the ground. He went to the spot where the brake pin had been pulled on the freight car 2 days earlier. He knelt, sifting the dirt through his fingers, and then he saw it, snagged on a splintered piece of the wooden chock. Almost invisible against the dark, oiled wood, was a tiny scrap of fabric. It was black velvet, rich and plush, the kind of material a man of means might wear on a suit vest. He brought it to his nose. Faintly, beneath the smell of soot and creosote, was another scent. It was a bay rum cologne, expensive and subtle. It was the same scent he had noticed on the lawyer, Ashcroft, when he had registered at the hotel. His suspicion solidified into certainty. This was not the work of a rough railroad hand or a disgruntled townsman. This was the work of someone who wore velvet vests and expensive cologne, someone who directed the violence from a comfortable distance. The next day, that direction became clearer. One of the local merchants, a man who owned a large warehouse near the rail line, came to Jude's office, a contract in his hand and a worried look on his face. "Sheriff, that new lawyer, Ashcroft, he came to me with a proposition. The merchant said he offered to insure my warehouse against any further troubles, for a very generous price." "What is the catch?" Jude asked. His eyes narrowed. "The policy only pays out if the railroad cancels its contract with the town and pulls out completely." Jude stood up and walked to the window. It was a brilliant, predatory trap. Ashcroft was betting on his own sabotage. He was creating the very risk he was offering to insure people against, ensuring he profited whether the railroad stayed or failed. He was setting the whole town on fire and selling them the water to put it out. The attacks were not random. They were a systematic campaign to destroy Dry Creek from the inside out. That night, the sky opened up. A cold, driving rain swept through the town, turning the dusty street into a river of mud. Jude was on his rounds. A heavy oilskin slicker pulled over his coat. He was watching Lyle Hart's apothecary, his gut telling him the man was the weak link in the chain. Just before midnight, he saw it. The back door of the shop opened, and Hart slipped out, carrying a small, oilskin-wrapped package. He moved furtively through the downpour, keeping to the deepest shadows. Jude followed at a distance. Hart went to the back of the church, where a lone figure stood waiting under the meager shelter of the eaves. The figure was tall and wore a gentleman's hat. In the darkness and the sheeting rain, Jude could not make out his face, but he knew. Hart passed the package to the stranger, who tucked it inside his coat. Words were exchanged, too low for Jude to hear over the drumming of the rain. Then the stranger turned and melted away into the darkness between the buildings. Hart scurried back to his shop. Jude broke into a run, his boots sinking in the mud. But it was too late. The stranger was gone, vanished as if he were a ghost. Jude stood alone in the alley, the cold rain dripping from the brim of his hat, feeling a deep, chilling certainty that he was no longer just fighting a saboteur. He was fighting a conspiracy that had already sunk its roots deep into the heart of his town. The failed chase in the rain left Jude with a cold, simmering frustration that had little to do with the weather. He stood in his office, dripping water onto the floorboards, the ghost of the stranger in the fancy hat mocking him from the darkness. He was fighting shadows, while the town he was sworn to protect was being bled from within by a conspiracy he could feel but could not yet fully grasp. Eleanor found him there, staring out the window at the muddy, rain-slicked street, his shoulders a tight line of unresolved tension. She had come to return the bowl from the stew, now clean, but she stopped in the doorway, sensing his troubled state. "You did not catch him," she said. It was not a question. "He vanished," Jude admitted, his voice rough. "Hart has an accomplice, someone with money. Ashcroft, the lawyer. I am sure of it, but being sure and proving it are two different things, especially in a town that would rather believe in curses than in the greed of their neighbors." The bitterness in his own voice surprised him. He turned from the window, his gaze heavy. "How do you do it? How do you stand it, day after day? The whispers, the accusations." The question hung in the quiet room, thick with the scent of wet wool and brewing coffee. Eleanor set the bowl down on his desk. She thought of the faces in the crowd outside her door, their features distorted by fear and hate. She thought of all the other towns, the other faces, the same whispers. "Because I have had practice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at his face, at the genuine confusion and weary respect in his eyes, and a wall inside her that she had painstakingly built over years began to crumble. "This is not the first time I have been called a curse, Sheriff. The first time was in a mining town in the Colorado mountains. I was to be married there." She told him the story, the words coming out in a slow, even cadence, as if she were diagnosing an illness. She spoke of her fiancé, a good man with calloused hands and a laugh that could make her forget the world's hardships. She described the mine, a deep, damp wound in the earth that gave the town its life and, too often, its death. She had been studying medicine then, learning from an old doctor, and she knew the signs. She had smelled the faint, sweet, deadly scent of gas deep in the tunnels one morning. She had pleaded with the foreman, with the men, with her own fiancé, not to go down. They laughed, she said, her eyes focused on a distant point beyond the walls of the office. They said it was just damp air, a woman's nerves. My fiancé, he told me not to worry. She took a steadying breath. I heard the explosion from our cabin. It was a sound like the world tearing in half. They sealed the mine. 20 men were inside. Jude remained utterly still, his own frustrations forgotten, lost in the stark horror of her past. The next day, Eleanor continued, her voice now flat and devoid of emotion. The widows, the women I had shared bread with, they came to my door. They said my warning had been the curse. They said I had spoken the disaster into being. It was easier for them to believe I was a witch than to believe their husbands had been proud and foolish. So I left, and the story followed me. The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of 20 dead miners and the echoes of a woman's life irrevocably broken. Jude finally moved, walking over to the stove to pour 2 cups of coffee. The action a small, necessary return to the present. He handed one to her. I am sorry, he said. The words were simple, inadequate, but they were all he had. He sat down in his own chair, the cup warming his hands. Her story had unlocked something in him, a memory he kept buried beneath the weight of his badge and the daily grind of his duties. Shiloh, he said, his voice low. The battle, I was barely 20. We were camped in a peach orchard. The blossoms were just coming out. We thought it was going to be a quiet morning. He looked down into his coffee cup. I have never seen so much chaos. It was not a battle. It was a slaughterhouse. Men I had shared jokes with 5 minutes before were just gone. You learn to stop looking at their faces. You just do your job. Reload. Fire. Try not to die. He took a long swallow of the hot, bitter coffee. I lost good men that day. Friends. And I learned something that has stayed with me ever since. The people you care for are the ones who can be taken from you. So you build a wall. You do the job. You protect who you have left. For me, that is Ben. He looked up and met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw the raw vulnerability beneath the calm, controlled exterior. I have tried to keep you safe, Eleanor. Tried to keep you out of this business with Hart and Ashcroft. Not because I do not think you are capable, I know you are, but because the thought of losing someone else. He did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. He had spent his life being the sheriff first and a man second, because being a man who cared, was a risk he was terrified to take. A deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. They were 2 survivors, each scarred in a different way by a world that took without asking. Later, as she was about to leave, Eleanor noticed his gun belt hanging from a peg by the door. On impulse, she reached into the small pouch at her own belt where she kept dried herbs. She took out a single, fragrant sprig of thyme and gently tucked it into an empty bullet loop on his belt. The tough, worn leather, a symbol of his hard and violent world, was now adorned with her symbol of healing and peace, hard and soft, coexisting. He watched her do it, his throat tight, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acceptance. The next morning, the dynamic between them had shifted. Jude was laying out his evidence on his desk, the special nails, the singed piece of velvet, the freight invoice she had found. I am going to ride to the county seat, he announced. With this, and the merchant's testimony about Ashcroft's insurance scheme, I can get the circuit judge to issue a warrant for their arrest. We can get a warrant, she corrected him gently. He started to protest. Eleanor, after last night, they will be more desperate. It is too dangerous. She met his gaze without flinching. Jude, my entire life has been dangerous. I will not be a bystander in my own story. We are partners in this, or we are nothing." He looked at her, at the fierce resolve in her eyes, and saw not a woman he needed to protect, but an ally he could not afford to lose. "All right," he said, the word a surrender and a vow. "Partners." It was Eleanor who had the next idea. A man like Ashcroft. He would want his land purchases to be legal and binding, she reasoned. He would have to file the deeds. The records must be public. They went to see the town's young pastor, a man with kind eyes and a belief that God's work included the pursuit of earthly justice. He listened intently to their story and readily agreed to help. The town's public records were kept in a dusty ledger in the church vestry. The three of them spent the afternoon poring over the cramped, spidery script, the air thick with the smell of old paper and fading ink. And there it was. In the weeks leading up to the first act of sabotage, the fire at the Longhorn, a series of land parcels had been bought up for a fraction of their value from owners who had moved away. The buyer, listed on every deed, was a holding company based back east. The signature on each document belonged to the company's legal agent, Meister, Alastair Ashcroft. The discovery was a quiet triumph. As they walked back from the church, a sense of cautious optimism settled between them. That evening, the atmosphere in Jude's small house was lighter than it had been in weeks. Eleanor had brought over some knitting, a warm woolen scarf for Ben to wear against the coming winter, as her needles clicked in a soft, rhythmic pattern. Ben showed her his prized stamp collection, his thin face alive with excitement as he pointed out stamps from faraway lands. Jude, watching them, felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. He found himself telling them stories about his mother, about her skill at baking apple pies and her terrible singing voice. He had not spoken of her in years. Eleanor looked up from her knitting, a genuine, unforced smile gracing her features for the first time since she had arrived in Dry Creek. It transformed her face, erasing the lines of worry and sorrow, and Jude felt his heart ache with a feeling that was both wonderful and terrifying. Their investigation had also unearthed a tragic, complicating piece of the puzzle. While searching the church records, the pastor had cross-referenced the names from the old mine disaster. Eudora Finch's son, a boy of 18, had been one of the 20 men who had died alongside Eleanor's fiancé. The pastor had told Jude quietly, his face full of sorrow, "Her grief has no place to go. Sheriff, it has curdled into blame." Eudora was not just a meddling gossip. She was a mother trapped in an agony so deep she had to make a monster out of someone to survive it. The next morning, armed with the land deeds and the rest of his evidence, Jude made his decision known. "I am riding for the county seat at first light," he told Ben. "This ends now." He did not know that Lyle Hart, sweeping the porch of his mercantile, had heard every word through the open office window. A sheen of cold sweat broke out on Hart's forehead. He scurried back inside his shop, his mind racing. That afternoon, the sky turned a flat, heavy gray. A strange hush fell over the town. Then the first snowflake drifted down, then another, then 1,000. It was the first snow of the season, arriving early and with a quiet, menacing beauty. Within hours, the world was a blanket of white, and the wind began to howl, piling the snow into deep drifts. The pass to the county seat would be impassable for days. They were all trapped with a cornered, desperate enemy. As evening fell, Jude and Eleanor realized Ben had not come home from his afternoon task of delivering a package to the farrier. A knot of dread tightened in Jude's stomach. He and Eleanor went out into the swirling snow, calling Ben's name. They found his tracks near the edge of town, leading away from the farriers and toward the railroad camp. He had been following someone. The tracks were almost filled in by the driving snow, but they could see where he had stopped, where another, larger set of prints joined his. There was a sign of a brief struggle, and then only the larger prints leading away. And there, lying on the pristine, unforgiving whiteness of the snow, was a single, small object, bright with color. It was a postage stamp, a picture of a steam engine chugging toward a distant horizon. It must have fallen from Ben's pocket. It was a tiny, heartbreaking symbol of a future that had just been stolen. Ben was gone. The church hall was not a sanctuary. It was a courtroom, and the jury had already reached its verdict. Every pew was filled, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, hot beeswax, and the sour scent of collective fear. Outside, the snowstorm raged, a howling white fury that rattled the stained glass windows and sent drafts snaking across the floor like icy specters. Inside, the heat from the wood stove and the press of human bodies was suffocating. The flickering light from a dozen lanterns cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, and in the wavering light, the eyes of the townsfolk glinted with a hard, sharp edge, like newly honed blades. Eleanor stood alone near the pulpit, the focal point of every hostile stare. She had been summoned by the town council, but this was no civil proceeding. This was a trial by superstition. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her fingers tightly gripping the small, time-scented handkerchief, its familiar texture a small, solid anchor in a sea of hostility. Eudora Finch stood before the assembly, her voice ringing with the clarion call of absolute certainty. Her black dress was a column of righteous grief, her face a mask of grim duty. She was not merely a citizen, she was an oracle, interpreting the town's misfortunes for the less discerning. "We have welcomed a viper to our bosom," she declared, her arm extended, a finger pointing directly at Eleanor. "Look around you since this woman arrived. We have had fire, sabotage, storms, and fear. She works her wiles not only on the elements, but on our men." A murmur went through the crowd as several women shot venomous glances toward the empty chair where the sheriff was supposed to sit. "She has ensnared our good sheriff, turning his head with her strange ways until he can no longer see his duty to protect us from the very evil she represents. We have tolerated it long enough. I call upon the council to hold a vote. Banish this woman from Dry Creek before she brings a ruin upon us from which we can never recover." A chorus of amens and fervent assents rose from the pews. It was then that Lyle Hart stepped forward, his expression one of pained reluctance, as if he were a man forced into an unpleasant but necessary task. He was holding a small wooden box. "I did not wish to believe it," he began, his voice oozing false sincerity. "But I could not stand by and watch this town suffer. I went to the place where she performs her procedures, and I found these." With a theatrical flourish, he opened the box and held it up for all to see. Inside, nestled on a bed of black cloth, was a bottle of ether and a handful of sulfur-tipped matches, the tools of a fire starter, the tools of someone who would call up darkness to do her bidding. A collective gasp swept through the hall. It was the proof they had craved, the physical manifestation of their fears. It did not matter that it made no sense, that Eleanor had been the one to help fight the fires. It was evidence, presented with conviction, and it was enough. The murmur of the crowd swelled into a low, angry growl of agreement. The motion was seconded. The councilman, a nervous, balding man named Peters, looked at Eleanor with pity and fear, preparing to call the vote that would cast her out into the blizzard. Just as he opened his mouth, the heavy oak doors of the church were thrown open with a violent crash. A blast of wind and snow swirled into the hall, extinguishing half the lanterns and plunging the room into a chaotic dance of light and shadow. Jude Hollis stood silhouetted in the doorway, a figure of pure, cold fury. The snow clung to his hat and shoulders, and his face was a raw, chapped red from the wind. There was a dark, wet stain of fresh blood on the sleeve of his coat, a stark splash of crimson against the white of the snow. His chest was heaving, not from exertion, but from a rage so profound it seemed to be all that was holding him together. He strode down the central aisle, his boots leaving wet, muddy prints on the clean floor. The crowd shrank back from him as if he were the storm itself. He did not even glance at Eleanor. His eyes, burning with a cold, blue fire, were fixed on the faces of the townsfolk. He stopped in front of the pulpit, his voice a low, ragged rasp, torn raw by the wind and by an emotion deeper than anger. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Playing games." Deciding who to blame for the weather, he swept his arm around the room. "While you have been in here, warm and safe, lighting your candles and sharpening your tongues, my brother has gone missing." The words dropped into the stunned silence like stones into a frozen well. He turned his searing gaze on Lyle Hart, who flinched and tried to hide his box of fake evidence. "You want to talk about evil?" Jude's voice was dangerously quiet now. "You want to talk about curses?" He took another step forward, his presence overwhelming. "Tell me, good people of Dry Creek, what is it you want here tonight, justice or a witch burning?" The silence was absolute, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind outside. Then, from the back of the church, a woman's voice, thin and sharp as a needle, hissed the word that had haunted Eleanor for years. "She is cursed." Jude's head snapped in the direction of the voice. He looked out over the sea of fearful, accusing faces. He slowly turned his head until his eyes finally met Eleanor's. He looked at her, standing alone, pale but unbroken, and the fury in his face softened into something fierce, protective, and utterly unwavering. He turned back to the crowd, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer ragged. It was clear, steady, and filled with a truth that shook the very foundations of the room. "She is the blessing I have prayed for." The shock of the words, the complete inversion of their entire narrative, was a physical blow. Before anyone could react, Jude strode to the heavy communion table that served as the council's desk. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a sheaf of papers, slamming them down on the wood with a crack that made everyone jump. "You want evidence?" he roared. "The sheriff returning with the full force of the law? Here's your evidence. This is an invoice from the freight office, showing that Lyle Hart, your concerned citizen, purchased enough tar oil and ether to burn down this entire town twice over." He threw down another set of papers. "And these are land deeds, notarized and filed, showing that Mr. Ashcroft, our distinguished visitor from the East, has been buying up your land for almost nothing, all while his partner here was doing everything in his power to make you believe this town was worthless and cursed." The pastor, his face pale but resolute, stepped forward. "It is true. I have seen the ledger. The signatures are authentic." Lyle Hart looked like a cornered rat, his eyes darting toward the door. Jude took a deliberate step, blocking his path. "Lyle Hart, you are under arrest for arson, conspiracy, and sabotage." The councilman, Peters, stared at the papers, his mouth hanging open. Eudora Finch looked as if she had been struck. Her carefully constructed world of divine signs and demonic agents was crumbling, replaced by the ugly, simple reality of human greed. It was Eleanor who spoke next. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the now silent church. She was no longer just the accused. She took a step forward, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, not with anger, but with a profound, weary sadness. "A curse is a story you tell yourselves when the truth is too hard to bear," she said. She looked at the blacksmith, who was sitting in the back row. "Ask Mr. Gable if I was a curse when I stitched his arm and saved him from losing it to infection." She looked at the mother of the boy who had been stung by a bee. "Ask Martha if I was a curse when her son could not breathe." She looked toward the men from the railroad camp who had come to see the spectacle. "Ask the men whose lives were saved at the fire if I was the one who brought the flames." She did not need to raise her voice. Her words were a litany of facts, a testament to the work of her hands, and they landed with more force than any accusation. She was placing their own lives, their own bodies, their own children, in front of their superstition, forcing them to choose. The lantern light inside the church seemed to grow warmer, steadier, a fragile but persistent glow against the raging blizzard outside. Hope was not extinguished. The councilman cleared his throat. "The motion to banish is postponed indefinitely. The vote was dead. The spell was broken. But the cold reality of Jude's first words returned to fill the void. He looked at the crowd, his own personal agony eclipsing the town's petty drama. "I told you my brother is missing. I believe he was taken." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of dark, woolen cloth, a man's scarf, crudely made. He held it up. "I found this near his tracks in the snow. This is the mark of the Rimrock gang." A new wave of fear washed over the church, but this time it was different. It was a real fear, a fear of known enemies, of violent men who lived in the hills. It was a fear that had a face. And as Eleanor looked at Jude, saw the torment in his eyes, she knew that their victory here, in this warm, crowded room, was hollow. The real storm, the one that mattered, was just beginning. The fragile victory in the church evaporated like breath in the freezing air, replaced by the gnawing, icy reality of Ben's absence. The townsfolk, chastened and ashamed, offered hesitant help. But Jude knew this was not a task for a disorganized posse. The Rimrock Pass was a treacherous beast in the best of weather. In a blizzard, it was a death sentence for the unprepared. He needed a small, swift, and silent team. The group that assembled in the pre-dawn gloom outside the sheriff's office was a testament to the town's fractured soul, and perhaps its first steps toward healing. There was Jude, his face a mask of stone, every ounce of his being focused on the single, driving purpose of finding his brother. Beside him stood Eleanor, her medical satchel slung over her shoulder, her quiet presence an unshakable pillar of support. The young pastor, his face pale but determined, insisted on coming, arguing that faith was useless if it did not walk into the storm with those in need. And, to the surprise of many, the 3 Chinese railroad workers Eleanor had helped stepped forward. They were expert trackers, men who understood the unforgiving language of the mountains far better than any of the townsfolk. They spoke little English, but their intent was clear in their steady, watchful eyes. They owed the doctor a debt, and they would pay it. Their journey into the pass was a descent into a howling white hell. The wind tore at them with invisible claws, driving snow so thick it was like walking blind through a wall of stinging ice. The world was reduced to a few feet of churning chaos. The man in front of you a mere ghost, the path a matter of instinct and treacherous memory. They moved in a tight line. The Chinese workers at the front, reading the subtle shifts in the landscape, the slight depressions that signaled a hidden creek bed, the angle of a rock face that might offer a moment's respite from the gale. The cold was a physical enemy, seeping through their thick wool coats, turning their breath to instant frost on their scarves. They encountered a sheet of ice stretched across a narrow ledge, a frozen waterfall that had become a slick, impassable barrier. While the others hesitated, Eleanor opened her satchel and produced a coil of thin, strong silk suture cord. Working with the pastor, they fashioned a makeshift guideline, anchoring it to a stunted pine and allowing the men to cross, one by one, their hands gripping the slender thread of hope. It was a slow, heart-stopping process, each man's life depending on the strength of a thread meant for stitching human flesh. Hours bled into one another, a grueling marathon of endurance against the elements. Finally, one of the trackers held up a hand, his body tensed. He pointed to a place where a cluster of boulders formed a natural overhang, almost completely obscured by a massive snowdrift. There were no tracks leading to it. The wind had scoured them away. But there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible smell on the wind, cutting through the clean scent of snow and pine. It was the smell of kerosene and stale smoke. They approached with the silence of predators, Jude's rifle held at the ready. Behind the drift, they found it a narrow opening, a fissure in the rock face, leading into a shallow cave. A thick horse blanket had been hung over the entrance, a futile attempt to block the wind. From within, they could hear the low murmur of voices. Jude peered through a small gap in the blanket. The scene inside was illuminated by a single, smoky lantern. Ben was tied to a rock pillar, his face pale and smudged with dirt, but his eyes were wide and defiant. Standing guard over him, looking miserable and terrified, was Lyle Hart, holding a pistol with a trembling hand, and standing near the fire, calmly warming his hands as if he were in a gentleman's club, was the lawyer, Ashcroft. He was speaking, his voice a smooth, confident purr that was more chilling than any shout. "And when the sheriff comes, as he surely will, you will give him a choice. Mr. Hart, the boy, or the evidence. A man like Hollis, a man driven by sentiment, will always choose family over duty. He will burn the deeds, the invoice, everything. Then we will let the boy go, miles from here, and you and I shall be on a train to San Francisco before the snow melts." The full, ugly scope of the plan was laid bare. The Rimrock gang had been nothing but hired hands, paid to snatch the boy and leave their signature scarf behind. A convenient misdirection. The real villains were here, in this cave. Jude pulled back, his face grim. He looked at his small, exhausted team. He formulated a plan, his words short, clipped whispers against the wind. He would go in alone, feign negotiation. The others were to wait for his signal. He pushed the blanket aside and stepped into the cave. Ashcroft turned, his expression not of surprise, but of smug satisfaction. "Sheriff Hollis, I was beginning to worry the storm had deprived us of your company. As you can see, your brother is quite safe. For now." "Let him go, Ashcroft," Jude said, his voice dangerously level. "All in good time," the lawyer replied smoothly. "First, let us discuss the terms of his release. You have some documents I require, the land deeds, the invoice. Bring them to me, burn them in that fire, and then you and your brother may walk out of here." He gestured with his head toward Ben. "A simple transaction." Jude looked at his brother, at the fear and trust warring in the boy's eyes. He let his shoulders slump in apparent defeat. "All right," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "You win." He slowly reached a hand toward his chest, as if reaching for the papers inside his coat. As he did, he pursed his lips and let out a short, sharp, two-toned whistle, a sound that seemed like a bird call, almost lost in the wind. To Ashcroft and Hart, it meant nothing. To a former cavalryman, it was the signal for a flanking maneuver. In that same instant, Eleanor, who had crept to the side of the entrance, acted. With a cry, she hurled her own kerosene lantern, its flame burning bright, into the mouth of the cave. It shattered on the rocks near Ashcroft's feet, erupting in a whoosh of flame that momentarily blinded both villains. The world exploded into motion. Jude's pistol was in his hand, not aimed at Ashcroft, but at the lesser threat. He fired once. The shot was a deafening crack in the small space. Lyle Hart shrieked as his pistol was knocked from his hand, his fingers numb from the impact. The Chinese workers and the pastor stormed the cave from the other side, a silent, sudden wave of motion. The Rimrock gang, caught completely by surprise and seeing their well-dressed employer was no commander, simply melted away into the blizzard, abandoning the losing fight. In the confusion, Ashcroft made a run for it, not toward the entrance, but toward a back fissure in the cave that led out onto a narrow, windswept ledge. He was not a fighter. He was a coward. But as he scrambled past Eleanor, his face twisted in a snarl of pure malice. He shoved her with all his force. She cried out as her feet slipped on the icy rock. She scrabbled for purchase, her fingers scraping against the stone, and then she was falling, sliding over the edge of the cliff. Jude reacted on pure instinct. He lunged, ignoring Ashcroft, ignoring everything but the sight of her disappearing into the white abyss. He caught her hand just as her full weight went over the side. The force nearly pulled him over as well. His boots skidded on the ice, but he dug in his heels, his arms screaming in its socket. He was holding her, her body dangling over a sheer drop, the wind tearing at her, trying to rip her from his grasp. Ashcroft, seeing his chance, grabbed a length of rope from the cave floor and lunged at Jude from behind. But Eleanor, suspended between life and death, was not helpless. Her other hand went to the pouch at her belt. She pulled out the scalpel she had used to save the boy in the town square. As Ashcroft looped the rope over Jude's neck, she swung her body, her arm arcing up. With a surgeon's desperate precision, she slashed the rope just as he was pulling it tight. The severed end whipped back, and Ashcroft, his balance lost, stumbled backward with a cry of shock. He teetered on the icy precipice for one long, terrible moment, his arms windmilling, and then he was gone, his scream swallowed by the storm. It was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of survival, his own greed and violence turning back on him. Jude's hand, slick with blood from where his knuckles had scraped against the rock, did not loosen its grip. He gritted his teeth, his muscles trembling with the strain, and began to pull. He hauled her, inch by agonizing inch, back onto the solid ground of the ledge. They collapsed together in the snow, both of them shaking, their breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. He looked at his bleeding hand, still clutching hers, and then at her face. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but a dawning realization. She was not a bringer of misfortune. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had been chosen, not cursed, to remain. When they stumbled back into the main cave, the fight was over. Lyle Hart was on his knees in the snow, weeping. "I just wanted the money." He sobbed. "He promised me a share. Jude," his face still a mask of grim determination, pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt and locked them around Hart's wrists. Justice did not shout. It stood tall, its duty done, and prepared for the long walk home. They built a larger fire in the cave, the 5 rescuers and the rescued boy huddling together for warmth. The pastor had a small sack of cornbread, and they passed it around, each person taking a piece, the simple act of sharing food a sacrament in the heart of the storm. Ben, his ropes cut, sat close to Eleanor, his small hand clutching the time-scented handkerchief she had given him, which he had kept hidden in his pocket the entire time. The Chinese workers, who had fought with a quiet, deadly efficiency, now sat staring into the flames, their faces unreadable but for a shared look of respect they gave to Eleanor. No one spoke of what had happened in the church. Their actions in the storm had rendered all the ugly words meaningless. As the blizzard began to finally exhaust itself, the first hint of dawn appeared, a faint, copper-red line on the eastern horizon. It was the color of blood and rust and new beginnings. They gathered their prisoner and began the slow, weary journey back down the pass. A strange, united company, ready to face the conscience of the town they had just saved from itself. The return to Dry Creek was not triumphant. It was a slow, weary procession emerging from a world of white. A small band of survivors leading their single-foe shackled prisoner back to a town that was just beginning to reckon with its own soul. The blizzard had broken, leaving behind a landscape of profound silence. The snow so deep it muffled all sound. The air so clean it felt like the world's first morning. When the circuit judge finally made it through the cleared pass 2 weeks later, the legal proceedings were a mere formality, a quiet postscript to the violence of the storm. The trial was held not in the church, but in the town hall, and the atmosphere was one of somber duty, not vengeful spectacle. Lyle Hart, a broken and diminished man, confessed to everything, his testimony a long, rambling account of greed, fear, and the magnetic pull of Ashcroft's promises. The captured members of the Rimrock gang, eager for leniency, confirmed Hart's story, stating they had been paid handsomely by a well-dressed man from the east to perform a simple kidnapping. The land deeds, the freight invoice, the testimony of the merchant Ashcroft had tried to ensnare in his insurance scheme. It was an airtight case. The court seized all of Ashcroft's fraudulently acquired properties and returned them to the railroad's ownership, the final nail in the coffin of the conspiracy. Lyle Hart was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor, The official record would state that Alastair Ashcroft was lost in the blizzard, a fugitive from justice, presumed dead. But the true trial was taking place not in the town hall, but in the hearts of the people of Dry Creek. The day after the rescue party returned, a line began to form outside Eleanor's small clinic. It was a line of silent penitence. The blacksmith, Mr. Gable, was first, complaining of a stiffness in his mended arm that was not really there. The mother of the boy stung by the bee brought a freshly baked loaf of bread, her eyes downcast, saying only that her son had been sleeping soundly ever since Eleanor had seen him. One by one they came, the same people who had stood in the church calling for her banishment, now bringing their coughs, their aches, their children's fevers. Eleanor met each of them with the same quiet, professional grace. She did not mention the trial in the church, did not speak of the names they had called her. She simply treated their ailments, her hands gentle and sure. Her forgiveness was not a speech. It was an action. It was the cleaning of a wound, the wrapping of a sprain, the prescribing of a soothing tea. She held up a mirror, not of their guilt, but of their shared, fragile humanity. And in doing so, she gave them a path back to their own decency. One afternoon, a knock came at her door. It was Eudora Finch. She stood on the threshold, not with her usual rigid posture of authority, but with a strange, hesitant uncertainty. She was holding a small, neatly folded woolen dress, its blue faded from years of being packed away. "This was my son's," Eudora said, her voice low and brittle. She did not look at Eleanor, but at a point on the wall just past her shoulder. "He wore it when he was a boy. He died in that mine, the same one." Eleanor said nothing, simply waiting. Eudora took a shaky breath. "All these years, the anger has been a stone inside me. I needed a reason. I needed someone to blame. When you came, with your own stories of loss, it was easy to make you the reason. It was easier than looking at the truth." She finally met Eleanor's eyes, and her own were filled with a grief so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. "I do not know how to forgive," she said, her voice cracking. "I do not think I have it in me. But I think you may have cured me of my fear. And for that, I am in your debt." She held out the small dress. "The nights are still cold. Perhaps you can unravel this, make something warm for the sheriff's boy." Eleanor took the dress, its soft, worn wool, a tangible piece of a mother's unending sorrow. "Thank you, Eudora," she said softly. "I will." It was an absolution, offered and accepted, in the language of practical things. Slowly, the rhythm of life returned to Dry Creek. The sharp, rhythmic clang of hammers on steel echoed from the railroad line once more, a sound not of intrusion, but of promise. The weekly market was loud and bustling again, the air filled with the smells of fresh bread and cured bacon. The children, who had once whispered "Hex nurse," now shouted, "Good morning, Dr. Dawson," when she passed, their voices clear and bright and free of shadows. The relationship between Eleanor and Jude settled into a new shape, one forged in fire and ice. It was a partnership of equals, grounded in a deep, unspoken respect. They did not try to merge their lives into one. She moved her clinic from the livery into a small, abandoned shop on the main street, and he helped her whitewash the walls and build sturdy shelves. Her lantern, its glass chimney now polished and bright, was hung on a hook outside the door, a beacon of welcome that was never taken down. Jude continued his work as sheriff, his duty to the town as steadfast as ever. But now, when he polished his badge, it seemed to shine with a different kind of light, one less of solitary authority and more of shared responsibility. Their love was not a refuge from their duties, but the foundation upon which they performed them. One evening, Jude stood before a town meeting in the same hall where the trial had been held. He had not prepared a speech. He simply stood before his neighbors and spoke from the heart, his voice quiet but firm. "A few weeks ago, in the church, in the middle of a storm, I said something. He began. I want to say it again. Here, in the quiet. So there is no misunderstanding. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the people he had known his entire life. For a long time, I have prayed for this town. I did not pray for prosperity or for an easy life. I prayed for someone to come who would help us stay true, someone who would remind us of what is right, even when it is hard. And then she came. He did not need to look at Eleanor. Everyone in the room knew who he meant. She came, and she held a mirror up to us. And I, for one, am grateful for what she showed me. There was no applause, only a deep, respectful silence. It was an apology, a tribute, and a new town charter, all in one. The days that followed were peaceful, filled with the simple, restorative routines of work and life. The evenings in Jude's small house were warm and companionable. One night, while Jude was working on his ledgers and Eleanor was reading a medical journal by the fire, Ben approached her with his large stamp album. He opened it to the very last page, which was completely blank. I was thinking, he said, his voice full of a boy's solemn importance. This album is for stamps from all over, places I want to see someday. He pointed to the top of the blank page. I want to call this section Wyoming and Beyond. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with an earnest, hopeful light. I was wondering if you would be the first to sign the page, to start the new journey with us. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that was more powerful than the fire in the hearth. She took the pen he offered and, in her neat, steady hand, wrote her name at the top of the page. It was an acceptance, a promise. It was the feeling of putting down roots. Later that night, long after Ben was asleep and Eleanor had returned to her own small room above her clinic, Jude found himself standing before a small, locked wooden box he kept on the top shelf of his wardrobe. He took it down, the wood smooth and dark beneath his fingers. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single silver ring. It had been his mother's. It was a simple, wide band, its surface worn smooth by time. It was a ring for a woman with strong, capable hands, a woman who knew how to work, how to heal, how to hold on in a storm. He looked at the ring, then looked out the window at the single, steady light burning in the window of the doctor's clinic. A decision, quiet and certain, settled in his heart. The day the first official train was due in Dry Creek, the sun rose into a sky of crystalline blue, a startling contrast to the white fury of the blizzard that was now a fading memory. The entire town, it seemed, had gathered at the new, temporary station, which was little more than a long wooden platform and a small, unpainted ticket office. The air, tasting of sun-baked pine and hot metal, vibrated with a nervous, joyful energy. Red, white, and blue ribbons, saved from a long-forgotten 4th of July, fluttered from every post. An energetic but slightly off-key brass band, composed of 3 railroad workers and a ranch hand, blared out a patriotic tune that was occasionally lost on the Wyoming breeze. People who had once stood on opposite sides of a church, divided by fear and suspicion, now stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces turned toward the eastern horizon, squinting with a shared, hard-won hope. The sunlight caught the motes of dust dancing above the newly laid steel rails, making them shimmer like a promise. Jude Hollis stood near the edge of the platform, a quiet island in the sea of celebration. To the casual observer, he was simply the sheriff, watching over the proceedings, his face calm and unreadable. But beneath the surface, his heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Every few moments, his hand went instinctively to the small, heavy box in his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn velvet. He had taken his mother's ring to the old silversmith in the next county the week before. He had laid the simple, wide silver band on the man's workbench, along with a dried sprig of thyme. "Can you engrave this on the inside?" he had asked, his voice low. 2 small branches, crossing at the stem. The silversmith, a man with eyes magnified by thick spectacles, had looked from the herb to Jude's serious face. Jude had felt the need to explain. "It is her scent," he had said simply. It was the scent of comfort after a long day, the scent of a clean bandage, the scent of a home he had not realized he was building. The distant sound of a whistle, thin and clear, sliced through the chatter of the crowd. A collective cheer went up. The train was coming. It appeared first as a dark speck, a smudge of smoke against the vast blue canvas of the sky. Then it grew, taking on the solid, powerful form of a steam engine, a black iron beast chugging steadily toward them, linking their small, isolated town to the rest of the world. As the train hissed to a stop amid a cloud of steam and the screech of brakes, the railroad foreman and the town councilman, Peters, climbed onto a stack of crates to make speeches. They spoke of progress, of the future, of the town's resilience. The crowd clapped politely, their attention more on the marvel of the train itself than on the words. Jude waited. He waited until the speeches were done, until the conductor yelled, "All aboard for the return journey," and a new wave of excitement rippled through the crowd. This was the moment. It was not a grand, theatrical gesture. It was something that had to be done in the open, in the full light of the day that this town and this woman had fought so hard to reach. He did not shout. He simply raised his voice, clear and steady, cutting through the noise. "Eleanor." Eleanor Dawson, who had been standing near the back of the crowd talking to the young pastor, turned. The sea of people parted for her as she walked toward him, a questioning look in her eyes. She stopped a few feet away, the sounds of the celebration fading into a low hum around them. Jude looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering. He did not get down on one knee. He did not make a flowery speech. He simply stood before her, a lawman and a man, and spoke the plainest truth he knew. "I prayed for a blessing," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet that had fallen around them. "I prayed for someone who could help this town breathe again. When I saw Dry Creek breathing, when I saw its heart start to beat true, I knew my prayer had been answered." He took the small box from his pocket and opened it. The silver ring, with its two tiny, intertwined branches of time gleaming on the inner band, lay nestled in the velvet. Eleanor looked from the ring to his face, and her expression was one of profound, thoughtful stillness. She did not cry. Her own voice, when she spoke, was as clear and steady as his. "3 things," she said, and it felt as though she were making a diagnosis, laying out the facts of their shared history for all to see. 1. I chose to stay in this town when it tried to drive me out. 2. I held onto your hand when the only other choice was to fall. And 3, she took a small step closer. I chose to love you without letting it make me any less of a doctor, and without asking you to be any less of a sheriff. She met his gaze, and a small, beautiful smile touched her lips. "I will accept," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet strength that was more powerful than any shout of joy. "As long as we promise to always continue doing the hard, right thing together." A long, piercing blast from the train's whistle cut through the moment, a triumphant cry of steam and steel that served as their applause. Ben, who had been standing nearby, his face split in a wide grin, now ran forward, holding his precious stamp album. He opened it to the last blank page, where her name was already written, and handed Jude a pen. "A new beginning," he said, his voice full of pride. Jude took the pen and signed his name beside hers. He then slipped the ring from the box and onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He leaned in and kissed her. A simple, profound meeting of lips that tasted of sunshine and coal smoke and the promise of a shared future. "Do not kiss for too long," Ben piped up, his voice a loud whisper. "The train will be late." A wave of warm, genuine laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the last of the tension. In the back, a few hushed whispers of the word cursed could still be heard, the last dying embers of an old fear. But then, a single person began to clap. It was Eudora Finch. Her applause was slow, deliberate, and loud. One by one, others joined in, until the entire platform was filled with a thunderous rolling ovation, a sound of communal acceptance, of a truth, finally, fully embraced. They stood together for a long time after the train had pulled away, watching the steel rails shrink into the distance. The setting sun burned the sky a fiery orange, and the shadow of a lone hawk circled high above. The west was still wild, the land was still hard, but here, in this small pocket of civilization, the people had changed. That night, after the last of the celebratory bonfires had burned down to embers, they found themselves in the quiet of Jude's kitchen. A few stray bits of soot and ash from the celebration still clung to Eleanor's hair, dark specks against the lighter strands. Jude reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he began to carefully pick them out, one by one. It was a slow, intimate task, performed in the warm, flickering lamplight. When he was done, Eleanor reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out her small, time-scented handkerchief, the one she had gripped so tightly in the church. She folded it neatly and placed it on the table. Jude picked it up. He did not give it back to her. Instead, he walked over to a small wooden dresser, the one where his mother had kept her linens, and opened a drawer. He placed the handkerchief inside, its clean herbal scent mingling with the faint, lingering smell of cedar. He closed the drawer with a soft, final click. He turned back to her, his eyes warm in the lamplight. "This," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, "is the smell of home." He opened the kitchen window to let in the cool night air. A gentle breeze drifted in, carrying with it the clean, earthy scent of distant rain, a promise of the new season to come. The seasons turned, and the promises of the railroad began to bear fruit in Dry Creek. The raw, desperate edge of the town softened, replaced by the steady hum of commerce and community. The new lifeblood of the town was not silver or speculation, but the simple, daily rhythm of people working, building and living together. Eleanor's clinic was the heart of that new rhythm. The small shop, with its whitewashed walls and neatly organized shelves of tinctures and bandages, was rarely empty. She set bones, delivered babies, and dispensed not only medicine, but also a quiet, steady dose of common sense and compassion. She was no longer an outsider. She was the town's healer, an essential part of its fabric. Her days were long and demanding, but for the first time in her life, she felt the deep, anchoring satisfaction of belonging. She had stopped looking over her shoulder for the next wave of misfortune, learning to trust in the solid ground beneath her feet, a trust she had earned not by running, but by standing her ground. Jude, for his part, found that keeping the peace was a different task now. The brawls between railroad workers and locals subsided, replaced by a shared interest in the town's prosperity. His work became less about putting out fires and more about tending the slow, steady growth of a civil society. He was still the law, the solitary figure of authority when needed, but he was no longer a lone guardian. He and Eleanor moved in a comfortable, complementary orbit, when a dispute over a property line turned into a shouting match that ended with one man nursing a split lip. Jude was there to mediate the argument while Eleanor was there to stitch the wound. They worked side by side, each sovereign in their own domain, their partnership a living example of the town's new balance. The healing of Dry Creek was not just a matter of individual hearts. It became a public endeavor. The young pastor, inspired by the unity forged in the storm, worked with Eleanor to establish a small welfare fund for the railroad workers and their families, ensuring that an injury on the job would not mean starvation for a man's wife and children. The first and largest donation to the fund came from the town council, using the money seized from Ashcroft's accounts. The most poignant contribution, however, came from Eudora Finch, one cool autumn morning. She arrived at the church with a large, heavy basket filled with dozens of pairs of thick, warm, woolen socks and mittens. She had spent the past month in her parlor, not organizing prayer meetings to cast out demons, but painstakingly unraveling the small blue dress of her long-dead son, its threads of grief and memory re-knit into objects of practical warmth. She placed the basket in the collection box without a word. Later that week, several people saw her at the town cemetery for the first time in years. She stood before the small, weathered headstone of her son, and instead of weeping, she simply placed a small bouquet of wild thyme at its base before walking away, her back straight, her face calm in the afternoon sun. She had finally laid her anger to rest alongside her boy. The symbols of the town's dark chapter were transformed into emblems of its resilience. Eleanor's lantern, the one her father had given her, now hung permanently from a hook beside the door of her clinic. Every evening at dusk, she would light it, and its steady, protected flame became a quiet promise to the town a light would always be on. Help was always near. In Jude's house, Ben's stamp album became a chronicle of their expanding world. One day, a letter arrived bearing a stamp with a grand illustration of the Pacific Line, celebrating the completion of the transcontinental connection, with great ceremony. Ben pasted it onto the first spot of the Wyoming and Beyond page. Right below the signatures of Eleanor and Jude, the future was no longer a fearsome unknown. It was a destination they were all traveling toward together. The love between Jude and Eleanor settled into a comfortable, easy domesticity, punctuated by the same light-hearted humor that had first drawn them together. One morning, as Jude handed her a mug of his notoriously strong, sludgy coffee, she took a sip and made a face. "Sheriff," she said, her eyes twinkling over the rim of the mug, "I have faced down blizzards, mobs, and fire. I have set bones and stitched arteries, but I still believe this coffee is the most dangerous thing in Dry Creek." He leaned against the counter, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble, "I suppose that is why a town needs a good doctor, to save its people from its sheriff." She laughed, a clear, happy sound that filled the small kitchen, a sound that was now as much a part of the house as the scent of thyme from the drawer in the dresser. Their life, like the town's, had found its peace. The conspiracy that had threatened to tear Dry Creek apart was a story now told to newcomers, a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting fear rule over reason. The railroad, once a source of conflict, was now the town's lifeline, bringing mail, supplies, and new faces every day. Dry Creek had been pushed to the brink, but in saving itself from a villain, it had also saved itself from its own worst instincts. It had learned that a curse only has the power you are willing to give it, and that its power dissolves in the face of courage, truth, and love. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the red hills, casting long shadows across the prairie, Jude and Eleanor stood on the station platform. The air was cool, and the steel rails, still warm from the day's sun, glowed with a soft, coppery light. The evening train was pulling away, its whistle a long, mournful cry of departure. Down the track, Ben ran alongside the slow-moving cars, waving his hat in a gesture of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a picture of perfect peace, a town with a home, a law, and a healer, all standing together under the vast Wyoming sky. As they watched, two of the older women from the bakery, their arms full of empty baskets, walked by. One of them nodded toward Eleanor and whispered to her friend, just loud enough to be heard, "Some still say she is cursed. You know, that she draws trouble." The other woman nodded sagely. But just then, a group of children, their school day done, came running past, laughing as they chased a stray dog. One of them stumbled, and Eleanor instinctively moved toward him, but he picked himself up, grinned, and shouted, "Good evening, Dr. Dawson. Good evening, Sheriff," before running on. Jude heard the women's whispers, He felt Eleanor tense slightly beside him. He did not turn to confront them. He did not need to. He simply smiled. A quiet, confident smile. He reached up, took off his hat, and held it over his heart in a gesture of respect to the departing train, to his town, and to the woman standing beside him. "She is the blessing I prayed for," he said, his voice soft but clear in the evening air. "And this whole town knows it." Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.